I welcome you. I'm sorry, I just got interrupted by a notification. Good morning, everyone. I welcome you all to our webinar, which has been named Writing Freedom, Rethinking Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain. Begum Rokeya was a Bengali Muslim, feminist writer, educationist, and social reformer. Born in 1880 in modern-day Bangladesh, her works were devoted to the dual goals of women's emancipation and resistance to colonial rule. In fact, her story, Sultana's Dream, which our university has included as part of her curriculum on women's writing, is hailed as a pioneering work of feminist science fiction from Asia. To truly grasp the significance of her life and her work to us as students of literature, we are very, very honored to have with us Ma'am Kalyani Dutta, who is an award-winning translator and has also taught in the English department of the Indraprastha College for Women from 1964 to 2007 with a number of academic publications, one of which is Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain's Gyanfal and Muktifal, a critique of the iconography of the nation as mother. It was published in the Indian Journal of Gender Studies in 2000. Her book Freedom Fables, which brings together two satires and a collection of writings by Begum Rokeya between 1905 to 1932, that is until the time of her demise, was nominated for the Crossword Translation Prize in 2019. Now, to kick off the discussion, I wanted to list out a few questions that one could think of while studying the text of Sultana's Dream and a bit on Begum Rokeya's life. And moving on, the first question is, ma'am, we want to know from you, how relevant is the social commentary of Begum Rokeya from 120 years back in today's times? And the second question we want to know from you is about the gender politics that has been depicted in Sultana's Dream, especially emphasizing on the condescension bordering on misandry with which the men and their work were looked upon. And ma'am, thirdly, specifically, we wanted to know from you if it was her non-affiliation to political parties that made Begum Rokeya much lesser acknowledged than her contemporaries like Sarojini Naidu when it came to 20th century feminist writers from Southeast Asia. So so ma'am, we really look forward to hear from you on these lines and much more. And before I hand you over the mic, I just want to remind the audience that they may ask their question either through the chat box after ma'am's done speaking, or they can directly unmute themselves and put it across. With that, I hand over the mic to you, ma'am.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Anushka and Sharmila, for allowing me to speak about one of my favorite authors. I would like to talk a little bit about the achievement of Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain. I consider that Rokeya has suffered a kind of a strange fate as far as her reputation as a writer is concerned. I mean, there is something that publishers ask you to do. Once I checked and I found that she was being taught, her one text was being taught in various Western universities under various disciplines of women and science fiction, of course, gender relations, feminist writing, women writing, utopian studies, futurist studies. So in a way, she seemed to be very popular. I mean, amongst academia, at least she was known amongst scholars of these various disciplines. But as far as the general reader is concerned, if I happen to mention during the time when I was preparing Freedom Fables, what are you working on? If I said Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain, there was kind of puzzlement, and there was no recognition value of her name, I felt. Now, the situation that has come about is that Sultana's Dream, as you know, is her only work in English. I mean, she wrote a great deal in English, but those were addresses, etc., etc. But as far as fiction is concerned, Sultana's Dream is the only one that she has written in English, and it is a slight work and slight in size, though, of course, very enjoyable. So, but the main corpus of her writing is in Bengali. like Mahashita Devi or Rashundari Devi, she writes in Bengali a great deal of very polemical, very fiercely argued, and she is a committed writer, passionately committed to her main causes of women's education and education as a way of liberating women from the stranglehold of patriarchy, and also equally interested in the question of the country's freedom, which in those early times was, I mean, had not yet gained impetus as such. So these were her commitments, and she wrote fiercely about them in very, I mean, I discovered that she had written a great deal in Bengali. Uh, and she chose to write in Bengali. I mean, her work of fiction, her important writings was in Bengali, and that was a conscious choice. It went against the tradition in her own house, in her own Sabir household, back in Rangpur in North East Bengal of that time. The norm was the family was chose to speak in Urdu, not Bengali. Bengali was regarded as a language of peasants with whom the ashrafs, the nobility, preferred not to associate at all. But she chose to write in Bengali because she had decided from early on where her target audience was, where was her writing, her work, where was it to be concentrated. And it was upon those Pardanashin, homebound, incarcerated in their houses, those middle class Bengali women. That is where she wanted to address herself and bring them some respite, being education. So the rigorously controlled women of the upper classes is where she addressed. So it is in her Bengali articles, stories, poems, articles, satires that are interesting ideas, her commitments, arguments, passionate arguments are discussed. And she never lost sight of her agenda of liberating women from the hold of patriarchy, at least to bring some measure of liberation in their way of thinking, as it were. And at the same time, she engaged fully with all the issues which were uh, current in those very tumultuous times. Early 20th century was the time when the liberations, a lot was happening in Bengal, all sorts of agitations were aloft. So she was fully engaged with all the issues that were current at that time. And the little work that I have been able to accomplish, one or two essays or one slim book of translation, have all been with the desire to share uh, some of our very interesting ideas and writings with
with
uh, um, our fellow scholars and others. Something very to share the work of a powerful, interesting writing in an incisive and lively style. Uh, However, I must say that the first work of Rokeya that I encountered was not Sultana's Dream, which is otherwise so popular. It was a work called Oborodh Vashini, which means it has been translated in English by Roshan Jahan as In Seclusion. Um, I found this in a volume which came out during the International Women's Year in 1989. It is a slim book containing writings by Bengali women writing in the period of colonial period. And Rokeya's name was one which was not familiar to me. So when this Aburud Bashini is a collection about 40 odd little vignettes describing, dealing with the life experience of women who live behind Parda. Uh, there are, and it cuts across communities, both Hindu women and Muslim women. What they undergo under the system of Parda is what she deals with. There are a few tragic incidents, but for the most part, the impression of Aburud Bashini, the stories that are there, is hilarious. And the ridiculous catatonic states to which these women got into because they had totally internalized all the rigors of the Parda system are what she focuses on. Um, so what is interesting to me was that two incidents there relate to her own childhood. Um, and it makes me feel that that is one of the strong motivations behind her visualization of her imagination of Sultana's dream. That went, Sultana's dream seems very light, but there's a strong revulsion against Parda that you find in that book. So upon reading the short excerpts, I was impressed that a woman of those times from a conservative background could be writing in such free and frank way, mocking this system which had its iron hold upon communities of Indian women generally at that period. So now what she does is that she allows the stories to speak for themselves. Um, it is as it were she is killing by ridicule. Um, the one story about her own childhood, which explains the claustrophobic world that she lived in, can be. First, I must we must understand the kind of household that she came to. Her own in Bengal in those days, the nobility, the landed class, did not associate. They claimed that they were descended from foreign scholars and nobility who had arrived. And as such, they did not allow in their households Bengali to be spoken. They dissociated themselves completely from the poor peasants who were their co-religionists, which is why it was found later that the poor peasants who were larger in number than Hindu were in very poor condition because their community did nothing for them. Now, as often happens, the higher you are among, I mean, that is the practice of men historically, the higher you are, the achievements, the conquests, they are all centered upon the lives of women. To show their exclusivity and their nobility, in the Sabir household, Parda system was especially rigorous. Whereas other families may practice Parda from men, in Rokeya's own childhood, in her own homes, they observed Parda also from strange women. And it was impressed upon this little 5-year-old child that she must never be seen. If neighbors came to visit, she would find a door or some under the bed to hide herself. If she did not interpret the frowns of her elders, she would be later called Begairat, without discipline. It so just happened, the story that she describes, that two women from her cousin's village came to visit, two maidservants. They went everywhere, but Rokeya, this child, was told, "You must not be seen at all." So she ran up the stairs to an attic room, and where she stayed for during the visit of these women who went everywhere. And everyone in that large household forgot about the little child. And she would only get a drink of water or something to eat if her nephew ran up to the room. And there's a little faint resentment which comes through when you read that story, because she says, I was tremulous as a chick, but a chick has her mother's feathers to hide under. I had no one to protect me. So the resentment is that even her mother forgot. So keen were they to preserve that keep intact the parda system in that room, that even the child they forgot about her and did not rescue her till the visit was over. All this, of course, must have left an impression upon her, the claustrophobic world which she inhabited as a child. And whereas other women internalized and probably felt protected and proud of their privilege and the nobility because they lived, observed Pardas, Rokeya never accepted it in her life, and which is when, after her marriage, she wrote, she says, in the course of one afternoon when her servant was away, she wrote this story of Sultana's dream. She could not have conceived of all the ideas, all the brilliant inventions that she puts in that book in the course of an afternoon. These things must have been boiling inside her, especially the resentment, the strangled hold of the Parda system. So Avirud Bashini is the first book which I read, and it aroused my curiosity as to know how a woman of those times could write in such a lively way and such a strong way, mockingly, but still in a very lively fashion. So as our habit as academics, of course, I hide myself to the library to find various books of history of Bengali literature, where I drew a total blank. It is as if the Bengali Muslim writers were totally invisible. Uh, not Rokeya, not anybody else was to be found there. And it is not as if the Muslims were not writing. They had journals of their own where Rokeya wrote frequently. Nobunur was a very famous journal of the time. They wrote of their own concern, and I feel very happy that they did so. But what must have happened is that those were the days of the Bengal Renaissance. Giants of Bengali literature were striding upon the literary stage. There were other things happening. It was the time of this Swadeshi Andolon, the Bongo Bongo Andolon. All this was going on in the ensuing excitement. The literary establishment, not intentionally, forgot. I mean, it was overlooked, as it might say. It was an oversight that they were not seeing. So for a long time, I was keen to read other writings by Rokeya, and I was fortunate that historian Parthasarathi Gupta had been gifted a book of Rokeya's Rachanabuli, collected writings of Rokeya, which had been published by Bangla Academy, edited by Abdul Qadir. In Bangladesh, from the beginning of its birth, there has been a lot of interest in Rokeya. And so that when I borrowed that book and I read, I found what a prolific writer she had been, because writing was not for her. Communication is what was important for her, not so much of literary expression for her. So there are a number of writings there, all full of very polemical, fierce, committed writings. For instance, one of the pieces which I read there, reading the stories and satires and essays, I came to appreciate the depth of Rokeya's commitment to the cause of women's education as a necessary step towards freeing the minds of women. And what was implied in Sultana's dream and Avarod Bashini in innuendos and nuances, uh, in her other pieces of writing, for instance, one which is called Sri Jatir Avanati, the degradation of women, is expressed in um, uh, strong words and something. For instance, in 1907, Sri Jatir Avanati, which Rokeya began writing and called it Amader Avanati, which means that she had taken upon herself in that particular piece of writing to discuss how, for instance, all of mankind and her own community in particular, men as well as women, how had they fallen? What is that has happened? Uh, in the story, it'll come out how the name was changed. So in Amadir Avanati, she begins in a very fierce manner, where it said, I believe the slavery system has been abolished. How is it then that we have women as slaves? So that women have been enslaved. So she continues that analysis um, of what had happened in society historically, how women had been slowly deprived of their power, of their volition, and had turned into only puppets. So she blames women, the supine consciousness of women, for all the power, ability to work constructively for society had been taken slowly away from their hands by men until they had turned only into kind of mannequins for ornament, that they were heaped with ornaments. They had given up all their liberty and power of thinking and power to work powerfully. This is how um, they became and were accused by the men themselves of nasul akal, having no akal, having no intelligence. So this is what happened. So she proceeded to tracing the historical deprivation of women and how it. So absorbed was she in this subject that she forgot the milieu in which she was writing. Uh, what kind of society? Where was she? Where was she writing? This happened to her often. She was so passionate when she carried on writing, and this was a subject which interested her deeply. I'd like to quote just a few lines to show you how rashly and daringly she launched into this attack upon men. Um, this is what she writes in Sri Jati. She said, "We have fallen as low as it is possible. Yet we have never raised our heads against this subjugation. The most important reason is that whenever a sister has tried to raise her head, the pretext of religion or commands from holy books have been used as weapons to smash her head. To keep us in darkness, men have declared religious texts as commands from God. So you see, these religious texts are nothing but man-made rules and regulations." Now, generally, even now and at that period, to write in such terms um, was extremely rash and daring, and swift was the backlash when she published it as Amade Abanuti something. All the 5 passages which dealt with her discussion about how religion enforces and narrows down the lives of women, how it is a kind of practice of deception upon women, were excised. Those 5 paragraphs are excised. And what is even more, what would you say, amusing or puzzling is that Rokeya had to consent, allow the piece to be published. What had started out as Amader Obuniti had now been changed to Stri Jatir Obuniti. Who could be more fallen than the women? So in a way, in that particular essay as published and edited, it seems that the women are made responsible for the degradation of society, for the downfall of society in that. So this is the kind of writing that she did at that time, passionate. It was characteristic of Rokeya to write in a passionate. Not for her was the mellifluous, lyrical writing, influenced probably by Tagore's family. That was not her style at all. She wrote generally in an abrasive, um, sarcastic tone. Sarcasm was her weapon. That was influenced by Tagore. Uh, Self-irony, sarcasm, these were her favorite weapons. She chose this by there's an example of the kind of writing that she found at those times not to her purpose. There was a very popular poet called Man Kumari Boshu. Rokeya quotes that poem. The poet, of course, in every verse laments the fate of women and ends each verse by saying, "And I wept and I shed tears." Rokeya's caustic comment was, "This sister has expended all her energy in weeping. She has no strength left for anything else," because for her, weeping was not her style. She would not lament. She would rather scathingly attack, scold both men and women, Hindus and Muslims. That was her. That was the way she wrote. Um, what had happened to her exposition in Sri Jati's Avaniti taught Rokeya that, as they said, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Sonia Nashat Amin has written that in those days, the Bhadra Mohila, the upper class women who wrote, satire was not their chosen form. That was not favored by them. However, for Rokeya, that was her chosen form. That is the genre in which she'd like to write. Well, Sultana's Dream is one. The 2 fables which I translated are also there. So that was dream visions, satires, allegories, farces. These are the forms where she probably felt that she was surrounded by and her target audience, the causes that she espoused required to break through the indifference of men and their convictions, she had to smash hard, which is why she adopted this weapon. So, so on the one hand, since she was establishing a school for girls and she needed government grants, she had to walk very carefully, very warily. She had to trace a path warily against government restrictions to be careful. On the other hand, and much more powerful, were the community leaders whose help she needed as to encourage the women from their households to send their daughters to be studied. If they did not permit, if she would not be able to, and they were always people of her community, and the Muslim gentlemen, the leaders who oversaw, were always ever vigilant where Rokeya was concerned. Here was a rather personable young widow who chose not to stay docilely at home, who moved around, spoke, and pleaded. So they were always cautious and suspicious about her activities. So Rokeya, therefore, had to adopt circuitous modes of telling the truth, what she wanted. But as we saw in the case of Srijati Ravaniti and various other occasions, so passionate did she get, and so that she very often forgot and spoke out, lashed out strongly. So now from her well, as an activist with a social and political agenda, which she believed that only she could execute and shoulder, she learned a survivor stratagem that tell the truth through the medium of satire or Sultana's dream, a dream fable, but tell it in some way. From her collected writing, I found two stories which I was fascinated with, which I thought that she had done a very brilliant job of dealing with the history or what the country was undergoing in that period politically. These are political fables. It is these two fables after which I've named my slim book of translation called Freedom Fables. One is called Mukti Phol, that is the freedom tree, and the other is called Gyan Phol, the tree of knowledge. These are elaborate allegories. Nowhere does she allow. Now, these were written on the occasion of the split in in Congress in 1907. Rokeya was not a Congress worker, though family members, her nephews later were very important Congress leaders. But at that period, Congress was the only party, early 20th century. And Congress, I think everyone knows the history of Congress, how it was formed in 1885. And it was formed to give Indians a forum to discuss the reforms, what they wanted from the colonial government in a organized way. For a long time, the Congress Party spread to various parts of the country. There were discussion groups. Their way of going around was every year to meet in some Indian city or the other. And the large number of delegates who came, they would prepare a petition which would be sent to London to influential and sympathetic parliamentarians to win concessions from the colonial government. Of course, for many years, this was a futile effort. In Rokeya, this way of going on only created great deal of humor. She was amused by this, and pours a lot of scorn on this this kind of process, this ritual thing which happened. What happened is that eventually some leaders came into the Congress who wanted a much more forceful way of agitating. So this was Tilak and Lajpat Rai in Punjab. They wanted a more forceful expression. They were willing to talk in terms of demands and not petitions. Eventually, this conflict between these two groups, who were called moderates, Gokhale's party, and extremists, who were not extremists in our understanding of the term, but the friction between them grew, and finally they broke apart in 1907. Rokeya was a very interested observer of all that was going on. Along with her work for her school, to establish a school for the girls, along with her writing, other kinds of social work, she was also an observer of the political scene. She was like the queen in Sultana's dream. For her, being defeated was not an option. When the Congress split, the schism in the Congress in 1907, she was deeply disappointed and disenchanted. It only confirmed what she had written in Sultana's Dream in 1905, that this is the ineffectual, the arrogance, the aggressiveness amongst men, their tendency to quarrel, renders them ineffectual in any kind of activity which would lead to constructive reform in society. This is what we find in Sultana's Dream. And the behavior of the Congress, how some viable way of unified way of opposing the colonial government had come to naught, how it had been destroyed, the opportunity had been lost by the Congress, made her feel bitter. And out of that bitter disappointment, of her disenchantment with the Congress, came these two fables which she wrote. The first was Muktifal, and the other was Gyanfal. There's also one more thing to be. Rokeya was a contrarian. When the truth had to be spoken, she did not hesitate to take up positions which may go against the opinion, prevalent opinion of those times, against the whole country as it may seem. One was much later. We all know the examples of Catherine Mayo, the American writer's book, Mother India, which had created a furor. The whole country was against it. What Mayo had done was to criticize Hindu society very stringently, quoting the pathetic condition of Hindu women. Well, she had in living in Benares, I think Mayo had studied Hindu society, so she wrote that. Even Mahatma Gandhi, who was generally temperate in his comments, said that this was a train inspector's report. Not Rokeya. She turned, it's called, her piece on Catherine Mayo's Mother India is called Rani Bhikarini. Well, in the story, in the essay as it develops now, the Rani Bhikarini turns out to be the Muslim woman. But she quoted, Rokeya quoted in her first paragraph, one by one, all the instances of the terrible condition in which Hindu women were kept or treated by their men. And then she listed them, and then she turned around and said, is this untrue? Can you deny that this does not happen? Will you say that this is, she has lied? And then she said, well, I have been saying this for all along, but now that a Western woman has said it, you are paying attention. So there was a great outcry, but as I said, Rokeya was not afraid to stand against public opinion, national opinion, to say this. To a certain extent, something like that also happens at the beginning of Mukti Pol. To understand this, one has to understand what happened. Now, when she was writing 1907, the early 20th century, those were periods. Bengal was in furor because there was the ongoing Swadeshi Andolon. The Lord Curzon had passed a law to divide Bengal into two, the Bongo Mongol and the partition of Bengal agitation. And most importantly, the Swadeshi Andolon. Now, what had happened is that all the agitation, the dissatisfaction, all that had coalesced in the figure of the nation as mother, Bharat Mata, the concept of Bharat Mata. We all know the song that is Vande Mataram, which had released. There were countless, hundreds of songs, paintings, stories, all coalescing, as it were, into the figure of nation as mother. Bharat Mata, the Hindu goddess, the mother goddesses, especially revered in Bengal. A lot of emotion, ardent fervor was invested on this imagination of Bharat Mata, the goddess. And that when the Congress failed the country in this manner, Rokeya erected her own version of Bharat Mata, which you find in the beginning of Mukti Phol. Rokeya's Bharat Mata is a kind of a violent, what would you say? She slams it violent against the faces of those of the sentimental poets who had written about Bharat, as to say, Rokeya's Bharat Mata is called Kangalini. Kangalini is a fairly powerful word to say completely destitute woman. Kangalini is destitute. She is the erstwhile queen of Bholapur, which is Rokeya's name for India in that particular story. She is mortally ill, fly-ridden, clad in rags, querulous, complaining. So that picture of a completely unromantic, unidealized figure of Bharat Mata is what Rokeya puts up. It is, as it were, to sell all these sentimental devotees of Bharat Mata. Behind all your wailings, have you really, this is what you have done, rendered to your mother. Take a good hard look of what has transpired, how your nation has suffered. This is Bharat Mata for you, whom you have neglected, whom you have really, not really, real hard, instead of quarreling amongst yourself, you need to serve her. In the story as it develops, and I admired, why I wanted to translate was that I admired her adroitness in writing an elaborate allegory. Nowhere does reality or names or incidents break into the story. It's all maintained. The fabulous floats over the real world, as you would say. But at every time you know what is going on in the country, what she is referring to. Bharat Mata, Kangalini, has several sons. All these sons in their symbolic names represent various trends of politicians of the time. All of them mill around confusedly around the figure of their mother, as the Congress did, not able to find any ways of saving her. Rokeya has also provided Kangalini with two daughters. And as typically for Rokeya, where these women are concerned, where the daughters are concerned, Sumati and Shrimati, grace and intelligence. That is, she is a strong believer in the agency of women, in the strength and sagacity of women. So the two sisters, the two daughters, are created in opposition to the sons of Kangalini, who are not able to save her. Ultimately, it is found that only the Mukti Phal, the fruit of freedom, would save Kangali, nothing else. She would die. And where does the fruit of freedom grow? Now, in this particular story, the rulers of Bholapur are jinns. In both stories, Kangalini imagines the rulers of India, the British, the imperial British, as jinns, those magical beings of Middle Eastern legends who were powerful and clever. Now, these jinns live in Mayapur, in high up in the hills, remote from Bholapur, but all the power is in their hands. Their kingdom is guarded. Mayapur is guarded by ogres. They are served by Mayabis. Now, the freedom fruit, centenarily growing, rare, grows only in 100 years, is found only in their kingdom. In the story, Mukti Fall becomes a kind of a quest narrative as two sons who, one might say, the story represent the moderates of the Congress party, that is Praveen, and the other, the extremist, the son Naveen. It becomes a quest narrative because these two sons set off in pursuit. If only Muktufal will save our mothers, then we must acquire it. So they travel through forests and various dangerous hills to acquire the Muktufal for them. The two sisters, Sumati and Srimati, of course, plead for being taken along. They must say they are more concerned and sincere in their devotion to their mother, that we must come along. But as is the wont of patriarchy, the brothers strongly deter them and say, do not speak, go and wash some dishes, to relegate women to the domestic sphere. That is their sphere. You cannot contribute. Within the story, there are 7 episodes. Muktifal has 7 episodes. Some episodes, they shift between Bholapur, where Kanga Lili is lying, Mayapur, where the Jinn emperor and his court resides, and also through the forest through which these brothers travel. Praveen, very reluctant, insisting. Now, this is where Rokeya amused herself by pouring a heap of ridicule upon Praveen, who insists on taking 10 cartloads full of petitions to the Jinn king, which he says, I will offer up to the feet of the emperor and plead to be given the Mukti Fall. Now, this is Rokeya's way of mocking at the Congress party's many years long endeavor to send petitions to the British Parliament, how ineffectual this was. Naveen, represent activist, is more energetic. He flourishes. Now, this is where Rokeya borrows from the ongoing Swadeshi Andolan. As we properly know, that the weapon in the hands of the Swadeshis to economically weaken the British was boycott. Boycott, we know, was one of them. Boycott of Western imports, the cloths. There are many important literature works which have been written on this. Naveen, of course, calls it Baikata. Rokeya was very clever to Indianize, as it were, the word boycott into Baikata. Young Naveen flourishes the Baikata and says, this is with how he's more feisty, more ready to fight. Also, he erects a bamboo ladder, inexperience, bamboo ladder with which he plans to climb up to the kingdom of the Jinn emperor and thereby, he says, acquire the fruit. What happens? Since this is a story which has been inspired by the schism in the Congress in 1907, the brothers fall out. Of course, they are instigated by the Mayabis who are sent by the Jinn kingdom to entice them. Praveen is only too ready to go away with the Mayabis. He and another son of Kanga Lili's, who was called Darpananda, are secretly lust for what they call tales. After all, this is also a farce. And what are these tales, which will, of course, they don't realize, dehumanize them? The tales represent the titles which the British used to award to their loyal citizens as Khan Bahadurs and Rai Bahadurs. Darpananda and Praveen secretly lust for these tales. So they will not want to annoy the Jinn kingdom at any rate. So between the two brothers, as there were between the two factions of the Congress, there is schism, there is fight. Ultimately, fighting each other, they fall off a cliff. And that is the end of their journey towards the Mukti Fall. They return. Meanwhile, the two daughters have been waiting eagerly to save their mother, that the brothers will come with the fruit and save them. When the brothers arrive empty-handed, the girls now no longer docile, scathingly attack them and said, we do not want to hear what you have done for 21 years. 21 years are the years which were spent from the beginning forming of the Congress to the falling off in 1907. We do not want to hear what you have done for 21 years. Why have you come back? You know that your mother's something. This time the daughters said they will not be kept back. They said, now as the queen, if you remember in Sultana's dream, had said that defeat, living in a conquered country is not an option for me. So the two sisters agree that this time they will go on the quest. They will not be deterred. Nothing will stop them. If they have to crawl on hand and feet, that is what they will do. They will climb up the hills and something. The two brothers this time follow. So the story ends in 1907, and then later when she revised the story in 1921, Rokeya could not have seen what form India's independence was going to take. 1947 was far away. So she has to leave the story at that point where the brothers and the sisters, men as well as women, journey forth striving to acquire the Mukti Phal. That is at which point which she stops. But uh, my bold narration of it does not leaves out a lot of hilarious moments of how you often feel that you can recognize the figures which happen, especially in the Mayapur kingdoms, when the courtiers or the crown prince speaks, you seem to hear the tones, echoes of what Lord Curzon may have said, in the infinite contempt that they have for the Bholapuris, for my Kangalini's sons and daughters. You hear the echoes of what the colonial government used to say. The other fable that she wrote, Gyanful, should actually have been the earlier story, because that is the story of how India lost its freedom. In this particular story, India has named Kanakadesha. The rulers, the British, live in Paristan, and the inhabitants are called Kanakadeshas. Um, this story is shorter in form, more compact in form, but temporally it is far wider. It's a more complicated allegory compared to Muktipal. Um, it has three levels, one might say. For some reason, Rokeya chooses to begin this story in the Garden of Eden with Eve and Adam. And maybe her uh, aim is to prove that women from the beginning have been, her Eve is from the Bible and yet not from the Bible. This is not the docile Eve who was sensuous, who, as Christianity made us believe, made mankind fall. This is a Eve who has her own volition, is intelligent. There is no serpent in sight when Eve decides to eat of the fruit of knowledge. She eats it, gains insight, realizes her position. Adam also says at one point, I feel like a Rajbundi. Rajbundi immediately reminds you of the political prisoners of the British. They are Human history begins when Adam and Eve descend on earth. Meanwhile, Eve's half-eaten fruit, knowledge fruit, had fallen on earth, and significantly for Rokeya's allegory, it has fallen on the eastern side of the world. Rokeya always believed, and she was very happy to report from Annie Besant's essay Noor Islam, that Annie Besant has said all knowledge one came from the beast. And Rokeya fervently held on to that belief. That was her pride as an Asian, you might say, an Indian. So that fruit had fallen, and out of that fruit, near the forgotten beach of Kadakadesha, had grown into a huge tree of knowledge, which was not known to the rest of the Kanakdesha. The second uh, level of the story begins in Pakistan, where live a group of advanced, attractive race who are called Palistanis. They have an advanced civilization, but they have no food. They have nothing to eat. This is how Rokeya, I would say, imitates or interacts or refers to the rapacious greed of Western nations in the early 15th and 16th century, which sent them off to various parts of the world, especially Asia, in search of wealth. So she says the Pakistanis have nothing to eat, so they set off in their ships and arrive finally across the seas, across many seas, to the coast of Kanakadesha. Kanakadesha, that is, we believe, historians say that once before the Western nations came, China and India were leading economic nations. So she calls it Kanakadesha, where they are surprised to find the Pakistanis. It was a thriving nation and food was abundant. Rice and mangoes. They are wily people as compared to Kanakalanders who are simple. That is Rokeya's idealization. Soon the Pakistanis find a way of wily devising to carrying away loads of food from Kanakadesha, rice and mangoes. There is abundant. And what is it that they trade? The story in Ganfal, the transaction between the Paristanis and Kanakadeshis, all in terms of fruit, food and fruit. There's in Muktip also there is fruit. Maybe not surprising considering a country which was ravaged yearly by famines, but foodlessness through that is in the modern period. Every year there was famine in India. So what the Paristanis import from their own country are makals. Now this in Bengali is a kind of a pretty bright, colorful fruit which is totally inedible. The simple Kanaklanders are so charmed by him that they acquire shiploads of makal fall and trade away all their grains of fruit. Very soon in the story, meanwhile, the Pakistanis themselves have grown guava trees. Now, this guava tree which grows on Pakistan are secretly hidden by them. This represents Western knowledge, which they imbibe but do not let anyone know about it. This has been nourished by the water from that ancient knowledge tree which grew out of Eve's fruit on the coast of Nabla. Now, this is the guava which the Pakistanis have, but they trade only makal. Very soon, so much rice and food is exported from Kanakadesha that there is famine. They have nothing left to eat. It is of their own fault, but this. So in this story, this is how Rokeya describes this coming of the moment, that they're followed the okay. Finally they find a guava tree on their own land. No, what happens is that one of the ships, the guava, this fruit of knowledge, the real, gets carried away to Kanakadesha. A few Kanakadeshis landers eat it and gain knowledge and fully understand the deception that has been practiced on them. They decide to grow guava trees for themselves, but are dissuaded by the Paristanis because now no longer Kanaklanders do not want their makal fall. So what are they to do? They need to trade, and they're not ready to give the rice anymore. So the Paristanis, they tried to dissuade the jinn traders from cutting down the tree by protesting and then pleading with them, falling down weeping at the feet of the merchants. But the jinns did not desist. There followed great disturbance now in Kanakadipa. The peaceful land was torn from end to end by the fires of unrest. The jinns were, however, relentless. Instead, they tried to bestow their opinion on the golden bodied people. They say God himself forbade the knowledge fruit for mankind. So, but what happens is that where the Kanakadeshas don't allow the trees to be cut down, but they are all cut down, and there follows great unrest. A kind of a Swadeshi movement takes place on Kanakadipa. In time, once again, there is a journey motive in the story. They have heard that there was a great knowledge tree somewhere growing in some part of the country. They journey to the land, but find to their dismay that that tree, because of lack of nourishment, because of lack of care, had died many years ago. So they weep and they wail, but then they are advised, do not weep for a dead tree. You take the seeds of the guava and plant knowledge tree. No, there is no way of going back to the past. You have to recover and find a new way of developing a nation. So that is what they do. So this story too ends with, and one thing which is strongly enjoined upon them is in the story is, okay, they said, this is what they are instructed, the advice, the connect. This has been said, we were punished adequately for depriving women of knowledge acquired from a woman, that is referring to Eve. So is there a disturbance? Hmm. So they are told to work. So what happens in enterprising boys of Kanakadeepa selected and cleared out a corner in a garden and then called out to the girls, come sisters, come and join us. We will prepare the ground with shovels. You plant the seeds. This is an auspicious day. Now we will have our own tree. So men as well as women, sisters and brothers will now grow and nourish knowledge. Symbolically, the guava tree, which something. Astounded, the Jains stood and watched. They were unable to prevent the Kanaka traders from executing this promising work. Thereafter, Kanakadeepa once again burst forth with wealth and harvest. The inhabitants lived happily. So this story too ends as Muktipal had, and for the same reason, that Rokeya could only indicate what to her seemed possible, that both men and women, unitedly, Indians must work united because Congress had something, and work towards gaining the freedom of the country, to create a nation, as it were. As I said before, she could do nothing else because she could not see her way clear out to what form the independence of India was going to take place. But one thing which she had emphasized was that nation, there was no way of neglecting women, one part of the nation, no, as the brothers had done in Muktiful, you cannot push the women away, you must involve them. This is how the two fables, as I said, I feel apologetic because I cannot bring out the wit, the humor, that Rukia had invested in telling these stories. But generally, this is the freedom fables that she had written. Um, the difference between the way the resolution comes in these two stories and the resolution which you find in Sultana's dream are different. In the sense that when Sultana, I believe we all know the story, when Sultana arrives in Lady Land, a viable, bright civilization has already been achieved. It has all been through the activity of the women. Um, It is a nation which has already been made. It is functioning, it's prospering. It has been created by women. But this has been successful because the lady landers, the women who controlled, who ruled, have excluded men, finding them destructive. Earlier, the women have excluded men, put them away in zananas, and only by their own strivings and efforts they have achieved this nation, the successful. Now, of course, um, in a fable, in a dream vision, you could do that. You are creating a utopia. You can exclude men. But in the real world, however submerged it may be under an allegory, in a real nation, this is not a possible. This is not possible. So when Rokeya in Muktipal and Gyanpal envisages working towards a successful nation, she has to emphasize that both men and women together will work and achieve this, work towards a nation. Um, it is an earlier world, the women who were excluded. In Sultana's dream, it is the men who are excluded. The conclusion, of course, is that women should not be denied. Historically, they have been, but they cannot. But you have to, in a real nation building work, you have to also involve the men. I do not know what more I should say about Sultana's dream. Um, it is when you come to Sultana's dream, I find the very first sentence of Sultana's dream deliciously ironic. If you remember how uh, how the story begins, do tell me if it is I am overshooting my time. If you would like to something, the first sentence of Sultana's dream is that when she says, "One evening, I was lounging in an easy chair in my bedroom and thinking lazily of the condition of Indian womanhood." Now, this word lazily is what I find amusing, and so would Rokeya. You wonder what kind of thoughts Sultana could have had sleeping lazily in her bed and thinking of the condition of Indian womanhood. What was she thinking? Anyway, Sultana seems to be ripe for some revelation, which happens immediately because Sister Sarah arrives and takes her on a journey through Ladyland. Being a perfect Pardanashin woman, Sultana, of course, says, uh, when she's invited to go for a walk, she says things in the men servants outside were fast asleep just then, and I could have a pleasant walk with Sister Sarah. She's timorous. She is the type of woman whom Rokeya wanted to address. This is the world of the Pardanashin woman. There is role reversal. Of course, it's easy and completely in the beginning of Sultana's dream. As Sultana is walking through the streets of Ladyland, she remarks that there are no men around. She also remarks that people are past laughing at her, smiling. And she is told because people find her mannish. Now, mannish immediately awakes qualities. I mean, of course, Rokeya is examining the fixed roles, is the essentialization of the qualities of men and women. Women are like this and men are like that. Are they fixed in those roles? In very many humorous stories, Rokeya examined this question. Are women really like this? Are they fixed in these roles? If there's no possibility, will not they change? Can they not, being given opportunity, be different? And are men like this? Are they really successful, powerful? These are the things which she, in pieces like Nari Shrishti or Shrishti Tattva, she would examine this question right and again, as she does here. Of course, here it's completely reversed, the roles. Um, what more could I say about this? In the story, if people would, and just briefly indicate, science in the hands of the women. In Ladyland, of course, they find men very distracting. When the queen comes upon the throne, the land is being ruled by men. All real political power is in the hands of men. The queen does not argue, does not waste her time. She creates two universities for women. One is for science, the other for something. Women are educated, girls are educated. She bides her time, as it were. There is an invasion of the country. The men who had been mocking women, saying, what a nightmare, when the women were studying science and building various scientific gadgets, technological innovations, the men had laughed at them as nightmare. They concentrated on sharpening their weapons. Now, these weapons, of course, prove completely futile, useless, when the country is invaded. The men are soundly defeated, and like Naveed and Praveen in the story of Muktifol, return to the kingdom to say nothing can be done against them. Now, that is not an option for the women at all. The queen says, she says that we must do something to save the kingdom. The women said, how? She says, by brain power. She sends them off to the universities to find some way of saving the kingdom. Weapons are devised, what looks like some kind of nuclear weapon by using of the heat of the sun. This is the difference between men and women. Women are against violence, bloodshed. So nobody is killed, but the heat of the sun melts the weapons of the opposing army, enemy army, and they vanish. The important thing is that before the university principals went off, the women went off to their universities, remember they said they made one stipulation. We will do so, but we do not want any interruption in our work. And also we will, it was reasons of safety, the men must retire into inside the house. They go behind jails to stay out of the way harmlessly, whereas the women go to the battlefield. When they return, the men, of course, want to come back. The police chief, etc., said, we have not been defeated. Let us come back something. The queen says, stay where you are. We will manage the kingdom. Uh, you notice that when the use of science by the women, that is, all of it is which is used for purposes of domestic, to cut down on the time, because Rokeya remembers, or she knows that women were relegated to domestic positions. Their days were, they could find no time to devote to any other creative purpose because their time was fulfilled by heavy domestic work. The inventions by the women scientists in Ladyland are innovations which cuts down on the work. As Sister Sarah tells Sultana, when Sultana says, how do you finish all your work and find time to do this kind of, she says, why? We have ample time because work is performed by machines of various kind. And so it's a creative endeavor. The, the use of scientific knowledge by the women of Ladylands is a creative endeavor to cut down on rest of the day they spend on domestic, rest of the day spent in creative pursuits and knowledge pursuit. Earlier too, when Sultana has said men work, don't they? They do so much work. How can they find? She had said skeptically, Sister Sarah said, do you know how they work? They waste. Now she's of course thinking of office work. They smoke 7 cheroots a day and waste the time in talking. Now, that is not what the women of Ladyland do. They hope to have many more important functions to survive. Um, one would say that one could see the use of science by the women in Sultana's dream, in the Ladylanders, is that it is a kind of a sustainable use of natural resources. It's not, they do not exploit mining activity or various kinds of dangerous experiments. Science is used creatively and sustainably to help the life of women. Non-destructive, something. Um, so this is what I find to say about something. If you would like to ask some questions, maybe there are very interesting. One thing would I say that um, many of the things that Rokeya talked about, the problems in her society of triple talak, um, uh, she has written pieces which I translated. In 2019, when I was preparing the book of Freedom Fables, I was struck by the fact that many of those problems still remain with us, isn't it? At that time in the parliament, there was a big furor about the triple talak bill, if you remember, talak something. Rokeya had encountered that also. In fact, her little piece about talak, which she calls Nadir Udikar, was the last piece that she wrote in a very poignant way. The night she died, this lady was capable of enormous activity and work. She had enormous, no wonder she laughed at Man Kumari Bosu and that this lady has expended all her energy in weeping. She had no recourse to weeping. She had no opportunity. There was her school, which she had established with such great effort to manage. She had very humbly, as we hear, gone off to study how schools are run, sitting in one corner of a classroom, as we are told by a friend much later after her death. She had established a society for women called Anjuman-e-Khwateen Islam, where women could meet and discuss their problems. By the 1920s, Rokeya had become an important spokeswoman on the subject of education for women, particularly um, education for Muslim women in Bengal. Her enormous energy was called upon by then, though in the beginning, during the Congress activity, women and peasants, the elites managed the work of the independence movement, the freedom struggle. They were elite men in both Congress, women not. But by the 20s, there were very many voices of women. Not many, but several. Now, these people, Sarojini Naidu, for instance, enlisted the help and cooperation of Rokeya as an important voice for women, in especially the struggle towards women's franchise, women's right to vote in legislative assemblies. But in spite of the work, the night she died early, at the age of 15, sitting at her table, certainly having dealt with all her heavy schoolwork, having dealt with other questions that came as a feminist and women's activities. The last thing that she devoted to her creative activity. She was writing a piece called Nadir Udikar. This was on the question of triple talaq. It was discovered under a paperweight on the table with night after the morning after she died. So it is touching in a way that she was still, when she died, she was still writing and thinking about women. She doesn't go into a diatribe. She just gives you a very short, small, maybe it's an unfinished writing. Her characteristic humor is present in mocking at old men, much married old men, because she presents us with a picture. She begins by saying, in our community, marriages are with the consent of both men and women, but what actually happens is that when it comes to divorce, it is only the men who exercise that right, just by 3 small words, a woman. And then she paints a picture of a young girl who is surrounded by other women who are not her, who are not sympathetic to her. They one by one take away her jewelry, and the girl weeps harder. And the man, meanwhile, this is a picture, just picture that Rokeya presents you with, without diatribe, that this is the fate of women which happens, young girl. There is a man, the man who's divorcing her strides around laughing and already looking forward to a second marriage. Whereas a family member, some guardian of the girl who is going to be divorced, is already present to take her away with a cart. So she loses at one stroke, she loses her position, her marriage, her role in life. She ends, it's a very short piece, and she ends by saying, in my district, there is a small poem. It's a country poem, she repeats. It's about an old woman who laughs and coughs. In expectation, he's happy because in the prospect of a second marriage at old age. Bohu bibaho, polyandry, polygamy, men marrying many times. This she knew was one of the evils which afflicted her society. I'll just end with one more piece that I translated.
Please,
Have I run out of time, Sharmila?
Yes, you have, because it's 12:20 almost, and we just have...
I'm sorry, I will stop here. As I said, that I'm apt to be carried away where Rokeya is concerned.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I'm sorry I had to interrupt you like this, because I feel we should have started. No, just unmute Kalyani, please. I think we should have started at 10:30 and not at 11:05. Anushka, just continue, please. Yeah.
Okay, so from the audience, if you have any question, now is the time, should.
Well, Anushka, I definitely have an observation to begin with, and it can just, we have very little time, so I can just say this, that I think it's been one of the most fascinating talks I've ever heard on the early 20th century Bengal, from the perspective of what Muslim women were writing on, and because this is a seldom told story. And I didn't think that Rokeya would have so much of political understanding from the way in which, having read only Sultana's Dream, but what you described in both Mukti Fall and Gyan Fall, the awareness of her political awareness was very, very strong. And that's been fascinating to know, because I didn't know about it one bit. So it's been revelatory. The talk has really been revelatory for me. Of course, I have a question or two, but I'll ask for others to think about. My questions are, one is that why are women and allegory so intertwined? Why does she abandon the realist mode? Why does she not use the realist mode, given that it is the heyday of the Victorian genres? That's one of the questions in terms of the mode that she prefers, but I'll leave that for a later time. But the mocking diatribe that she's capable of, she reminds me of Tarabai Shinde almost. The way in which you can lampoon the men. And in fact, I think our understanding of early modern women is very limited, and we tend to think that they were only perhaps passive in their understanding, that they weren't. I just wanted to thank you so very much for informing me, and some things that I just didn't know, and so many things are so fascinating. I think we need to sit down and talk about it, and not today. So I'll just keep myself to this observation. Yes.
Do we have any other question? You may type it out in the chat box. Please do it quick. Okay, I don't see any, so I would just put forward. Okay.
No, I have a question. This is specifically with reference to Sultana's Dream. Kalyani, don't you think she falls into essentializing men there? And, it's also with some of the other stories, the two other stories that you spoke about, on the Congress, that Mukti Phal and Gyan Phal. So can you just please comment on that? Thank you.
Yes, that she's essentializing men in Sultana's Dream. Yes, is that what you said? Yeah.
Yes.
In the beginning, of course, the men are the usual futile exercise. I think there is a role reversal later when the men have been pushed into the zanana, which she calls madana later. They seem to accept very happily their roles, role reversal of domesticity in the same, whereas the women run the country. I would have at this point, if there had been time, make a small reference maybe of comparison with Her Land, which Charlotte Perkins Gilman had written in 1915, for 10 years after Sultana's Dream. Gilman had written Her Land, which is also an imagination of a, you might say, feminist utopia, where the gender roles were very severely reversed, where men were either scientifically use of genetics bred out, and the few men who remained became feminized. Yes, Deepika, about there is, I, I, I don't think that later, as Rokeya proceeded with the story, that the men's essentialization of men's qualities are visible. And I have to think about it. Did you, what exactly did you have specifically in mind?
No, I had two things in mind. One is this, that men being constructed as essentially aggressive, and they're having to be controlled and confined in the zanana if that society is to develop. That was one part of it. The other is the gendering of work that is there.
Yes.
That women's work, that's women's work, domesticity and taking care of children. And this is what men are going to do now.
Yes.
So there is still that hierarchy of labor, which is very much there.
Yes, I suppose since it is a dream fable and in a kind of satire, that this has happened. I mean, as with the other two stories, as I said, that Rokeya has said that men as well as women have to work together and not think of get fixed in gender roles. But in Sultana's dream, yes, it has remained at that level where men are busy in domesticity and at the end of the story, and women do all the other essential work. That does happen to be the story. If I, at the same time, could respond to what Sharmila had raised, yes, Sharmila, in you said in the reality sphere, why she could not. Now, there are many, of course, essays where she does write about society in Bengal and India, such as in 1903, she had written one called Niriho Bangali, where there is a mockery of what she, of course, refers to Bengalis as we like everything soft, but she's actually laughing at men. And this stance of Rokeya at the beginning of Sultana's dream of lazily considering the condition of Indian women is mirrored in Niriho Bangali when she asks, she of course takes, as is her wont, in a very innocent way, taking an insider's tone of view. And she said, isn't it so comfortable to sit under a fan and read feminine reports rather than go out to the field and supervise agriculture and grow some more food? So that there is more food for people to eat. That, of course, that is a very ambitious plan that she has. But this being idle and not doing something concrete is what she condemned. She attacks and discusses these questions in realistic terms in many of her other essays and articles that she wrote. But in these two fables are, of course, allegorically treated. Was there something else that?
Ma'am, there is another question from one of the students. I'll just read it out.
Why do the readers find it difficult to accept the writing even when it is a dream, a utopia? Do readers find it difficult to accept? I think we accept dream vision as satire in its own terms. There is a feeling of discomfort in the way Ladyland works and where the men are at. Why do the readers find it difficult to accept the writing even when it is a dream? The way Ladyland works, yeah, but I think it cannot bear maybe being an utopian vision written in a light vein. There are touches and nuances and innuendos. She cannot proceed further. Is there a problem with the straightforward reversal of roles between men and women in the title? I think she wrote it for fun, as it were, maybe. Her husband, on reading it, said, "What a terrible revenge on men." At that level, it worked. So I think it is not probably it should not be taken at that serious level as permanently that she is specifying that men should be domesticated and women should take the lead. Her general discussion in this is that in society both sexes should work.
I think that Anushka, we should have to wind up the discussion today because we are very close to 12:30. So could we? I'm sorry, Kalyani, we have actually gone. I think it's a measure of good discussion. Anushka, please.
Ma'am, that was a very interesting session and a lot of new food for thought. I, on behalf of the audience and the entire English department, would like to thank you for your invaluable knowledge on the matter and for engaging with us. Thank you very much. And with that, would like to wind up the session. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anushka. Thank you, Sharmila, for inviting me.
It was lovely.
Thank you, Kalyani.
Yeah. Thank you.